Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at a Lavos build guide. Lavos is the newest Warframe that came with Operation Orphix Venom. Now you can get the parts for this Warframe both as drops from the event as well as buying it from the Necralisk from Father. The odds are only 4% for the highest stage endurance mode version of the event though, so most likely you're going to have to end up buying the parts from the store. Today I'm going to look over Lavos and give you an overview on what he is and what his abilities do, as well as how to build him and use him in an effective manner. I know I'm a little bit late to the party on Lavos, but this isn't a bad thing. It just means I've had a little bit more time to come up with ideas and tests to bring even more options to the table. The first thing you'll notice is he doesn't have any energy. This is not a mistake. Lavos is our first Warframe that operates on cooldowns instead. The only way to reduce the cooldowns on his ability is to cast his 3. Efficiency does not shorten the cooldown itself, but it will affect how much the cooldown is reduced by casting his 3. Just note that the 3 itself has a fixed cooldown and is not affected by its own casting. Another rare perk to Lavos is he actually has 2 passive abilities. Most Warframes only have 1. His first passive is called Valence Block. This passive gives him complete status immunity and a status cleanse for 10 seconds when he picks up an energy orb or a universal orb. The universal orb functions both as an energy and a health orb and is created by his 3. Now this passive can only activate once every 5 seconds and shows as an icon on the HUD. It can be refreshed, but it only resets it up to the maximum 10-second amount and does not stack. Lavos is the first frame to also possess all 8 elements and have access to them at any given time of his choosing. He achieves this by having initial access to all 4 basic elements, and you're able to mix and match them to create any of the secondary elements. This is his second passive, that's known as Special Casting. They function as hold to imbue over the ability slots. Up to 2 at a time can be combined to produce a secondary element, which will be consumed upon his next ability cast. This is the only way to get rid of the element. So make sure you know what element you want to use next, as if you have to dump it to get rid of the element, you're going to put that ability on cooldown. Each elemental slot also has its innate element that you can access through the hold to imbue. The ability that is associated with the slot also has the same innate element. You can find out which element corresponds to each slot by referring to the icon shown in the ability bar. Imbued elements will never combine with the innate element of the ability. For example, if I imbue Viral on his 2 Vial Rush, which has innate cold, it will cause it to do viral and cold, and not just viral. For the Helminth system, if you infuse abilities onto Lavos, it will prevent you from using the elemental imbue that was tied to that slot. For example, if you infuse onto his 2, you can no longer use the cold elemental imbue that is tied to slot 2. Infusing Lavos' ability, Vial Rush, onto another frame does not grant you access to the hold to imbue function. This is because this passive is tied to the ability slots of Lavos himself and not the abilities. Finally, the cooldown for Lavos' abilities is tied to the slot itself as well and not the ability. So if you infuse something onto him, it will use the cooldown of that slot and you will be unable to cast it again until it ends. Now we'll go over his abilities. First we'll look at Ophidian Bite, his 1. Ophidian Bite is a health stealing ability. It has innate toxin damage and only hits enemies in the line of sight with a 100-degree angle. Enemies behind objects and walls cannot be hit. It will inflict toxin as well as any imbued elements that you cast alongside it. The percent health stolen shown in the ability tab is the percent of damage dealt that gets converted into health regeneration for Lavos. This weapon has a base 8-second cooldown. As you can probably imagine of all 1 abilities, it is not good for DPS, but instead provides a solid heal that scales with strength. This will be Lavos' main method of healing if you don't have any other alternatives in play. More range lets you strike further out, letting you hit more enemies and consequently doing more damage and regenerating more health. You may want to keep in mind that other utilities can heal you, such as Magus Repair, or Elevate, or Iatric Mycelium from the Predazite Vizier. Because this ability only functions as a heal utility, and there are so many other methods to heal available, you may be thinking it's okay to infuse other abilities onto this slot from the Helminth system. But actually, you need to remember that Toxin is tied to this ability slot, and Toxin is required to make viral and corrosive with your imbues. So this elemental slot is pretty important. If you're not going to use Arcanes or other sources of healing, then casting this ability is probably going to be a must, since Lavos does not have energy. This means he cannot use Brief Respite as an aura, or the Augur set to restore his shield gate in endurance runs. His second ability is Vial Rush. Vial Rush has innate cold damage. Upon casting, Lavos will charge forward and you will be unable to turn. It has a base 30 meter total dash range. During this time, he will be throwing out vials to his left and right constantly as he charges, but it only covers a small area to each side and it does not scale. At the end of his dash, or when it's cancelled, which can be done by casting his 2 again or jumping, he will stop and do a large explosion. Hitting an object or jumping will make his rush end early and cause the explosion to happen immediately. This explosion has a base 9 meter radius and it will throw vials out also as part of it, inflicting base cold as well as any imbued elements. This explosion can hit through walls and does not require line of sight with enemies. It has a base 5-second cooldown. Range affects the maximum dash distance, the number of vials thrown at the explosion, which means more status procs produced, as well as the radius of the explosion itself. The residues left behind can continue to cause damage and produce status procs, and their longevity is determined by your duration. The amount of damage caused to enemies on impact from the dash, being hit by vials, as well as the explosion at the end of the dash and when they stay in the puddle areas post-explosion, all scale with strength. This is a utility ability again that cannot cause that much damage, but it has a very big range for status effects on its explosion. Because of this, it can easily cause a ton of status procs, generally maxing out whatever status you choose to imbue. This is extremely useful for viral or corrosive because you will most likely hit 10 stacks instantly. The innate cold is also a force proc and functions as a hard CC as it reaches 10 stacks and essentially freezing them in place. This is the ability you will get for subsuming Lavos onto other frames. His third ability is Transmutation Probe. This ability has innate electric damage. You launch forward an invulnerable device that travels at 15 meters per second for 3 seconds. It has a base 6 meter radius sphere aura. Enemies within this range will take electric damage as well as any imbued elemental damage as a pulse every second. Each enemy that is hit by this ability will shave off a base 1 second from all your other ability cooldowns, but not this ability itself. This scales up to 1.75 seconds with max efficiency. Even though you can scale up to 190% efficiency, this ability is capped at 1.75. Recasting the 3 while this is active will make it stop in place. The aura passes through walls, but the device itself is tangible and will be blocked by objects and terrain. It is also affected by gravity. This ability has base 10 seconds cooldown, and its radius is affected by range. The damage of the ability is affected by strength, but it is not that high, so don't expect too much. This is another ability with huge utility as it has a spherical shape, being able to produce a ton of status procs in a pretty wide area. It will convert all ammo drops to universal ammo drops. Picking these up will restore 10% ammo to all of your weapons. It will also convert all health and energy orbs to universal orbs, which will regenerate 25 health and energy on pickup. This is very important and will factor into synergistic builds later on, so keep this in mind. Finally, his 4 is Catalyze. This is his ultimate and it does innate heat damage. It involves him deploying probes that expand over time in 5 seconds to a max base radius of 25 meters. It can hit anything in a 5 meter elevation difference above or below, but that elevation is not affected by range. Enemies that are hit will take heat damage as well as any other imbued element. The total damage of this ability increases by 100% times the number of status effects present, so it basically works similar to Condition Overload. This ability has a long cast time, and it is the only ability of his that has a long cast time. His 1 is short, his 2 is instant cast, and his 3 is a one-handed cast. Once you cast the ability, it takes 5 seconds before it goes on cooldown. You cannot reduce the cooldown of this ability until the 5-second duration ends, so make sure you do not cast your 3 until after this. The max radius of the ability is affected by range, and the damage is affected by strength. Note that IPS status procs are not considered into the Catalyze damage multiplier, unlike in an actual condition overload scaling. The procs produced by Catalyze, such as its base heat and if you imbue other elements on it, are applied after the condition overload calculation, so if possible you want to apply all the statuses first. This ability will phase through all terrain and objects, meaning it will not be blocked by anything and will be able to hit any enemies within range. Because it has base 25 meters, you can very easily increase its range to the point that it encompasses the entire tile. You can also cast this ability in the air, which can be very useful due to its height limitations of 5 meters above and below. If set up properly, his 4 can be the strongest nuke ability in the game. To do this, you will need to set up with his 2 or 3 and other weapons. For his passive special casting, he has Toxin tied to his slot 1, Cold tied to his slot 2, his Electric tied to his slot 3, and he has Heat tied to his slot 4. Although his 1 seems to be the least useful, the element associated with it, Toxin, is needed to produce Viral, Corrosive, and Gas, which are all very important elements to get the most out of his kit, so you really can't infuse any ability onto him. Now I'll show you 2 builds that I've decided upon after all of my many hours of testing. The first one is a general use build that I find makes the best use of his kit and still lets him nuke. Then I have a dedicated nuke build I'll show you at the end, although I do find it's a little bit gimmicky and doesn't display his kit to its full potential. Now let's take a look at his first build. You want some duration. Although only his 2 scales off duration, another thing you may notice on his arsenal stat profile is that status duration, a unique stat to Lavos, also scales with duration. All his abilities inflict statuses. How long they last depends on this stat. 100% is the base duration, meaning a lot of the elements will only last for about 6 seconds. You really don't want to dip this into negative because it makes it very difficult to use condition overload on your melee or the built-in effect on Cedo, as well as making it difficult to get the full damage ticks from your ultimate before the status effects wear off. I'm choosing to increase it slightly with primed continuity so you get 155, as this gives you a lot more options due to the amount of range we're running on the build, and you'll pretty much be proccing status effects on the entire tile. Also, because the abilities have cooldown, more range means you get more status procs in a larger amount of area, so this gives you the most bang for your buck since we want as much status spread as we can get. This is why we're modding for so much range, as well as being able to spread a ton of status with his 2 and 3, as the base range of his 2 is a bit on the small side, and his 3 cannot reduce the cooldown of itself, so you need to use it widely. Next, we're running some strength but not too much, but we still want some to power his nuke. His nuke is extremely powerful, so if we can squeeze out some extra strength onto the build, it will extend the level range of how well Lavos can nuke. Now for our last stat, you don't really need that much efficiency, as it only affects how much your 3 will reduce the cooldown of your 1, 2, and 4, and the 3 cannot reduce its own cooldown. Because of this, you realistically can only cast your 3 about once per cooldown cycle when you're running his rotations, and therefore we won't build up high efficiency, especially because his other stats such as duration and range are so important, as well as strength. Still, you don't want to completely trash his efficiency since we want that cooldown reduction effect to actually still work. So we're going to slap on Streamline since we're running Blind Rage, as this will increase his effectiveness by about 66%, going from 45 to 75 efficiency. I don't think you need natural talent on this build despite Lavos being very cast heavy, as you won't be using his 1 that much. As I said before, his 2 is instant cast and his 3 is one-handed. His 4 is on a very long cooldown, so you won't be able to spam it as much as you like and you won't be noticing the long cast as much. I also really feel that we have a need for that last mod slot, and it lets us round out his build in covering all his weaknesses. Lavos cannot effectively use Shield Gate as he has no energy. As I said before, this means he cannot use Brief Respite or any of the Augur set. Thus, this means you're at a very high risk of dying when his shields break. I put him pretty squishy on the spectrum alongside Inaros if you're going for very long endurance runs. We have health and he has extremely high base armor, but that's obviously not enough for that scenario. First, we're going to take a look at his Arcanes. Well, the best option here is to stack his armor. Since we can't use shield gate that well, shield regeneration is out of the question. The obvious option is Arcane Guardian, but that procs on hit and isn't guaranteed, especially on higher levels that can get you killed. So instead we will go with Arcane Ultimatum, as you have many ways to force finishers and it has a 100% proc chance. It lasts 45 seconds instead of 20 and gives 1200 armor instead of 600. So I think all around it is just much better than Arcane Guardian. Especially because Lavos focuses so much on CC, it should be pretty safe and easy to set up. All you have to do is remember to proc it, which should be perfectly fine as the Arcane itself is refreshable. This can be done without the need of infusing any other Helminth abilities. Popular choices will include the Neramon Focus School, where you can run Executing Dash that now causes your Void Dash to not launch enemies and instead open them to finishers. Another option is Zacti, where shooting them with the Quill Dart causes an explosion that can proc a ton of status as well as opening them to finishers once again. Another option is Bronco with Dizzying Rounds, where if you shoot any enemy within 8 meters, it will once again open them up to finishers. I would say Neramon is probably the best option, as Lavos doesn't need energy, making Zeneric useless. He doesn't need Vazarin as much since he has so many forms of CC, and it still lets you use your secondary primer of choice, such as Kuvanukor or even Zymos. The other arcane I'm going to settle on is Arcane Eruption. You've probably seen this on other Lavos builds, and honestly, there's really no arguing with this. You pick up an energy orb, it has a 100% chance to cause an AoE knockdown on surrounding enemies when you pick it up. Lavos has a 5-second cooldown on picking up energy orbs. And the reason why this is so is because it's tied to his passive, Valence Block. When he picks up an energy orb, he gets a status cleanse and immunity for 10 seconds. So I guess DE chose to balance this out with a 5-second cooldown, meaning you can only proc Arcane Eruption at most once every 5 seconds. But actually there's a way around this. You can bypass this restriction with Transmutation Probe and a little friend called Synth Fiber on your companion. Recall that I discussed the probe turns all orbs into universal orbs. Synth Fiber activates upon health orbs to increase the armor of your pet. However, it also treats universal orbs as health orbs. Now, do you see the potential here? The interesting part is the opposite is also true. The universal orb is also considered an energy orb. Because Synth Fiber allows you to constantly pick up health orbs to fuel the effect on your companion, then in the eyes of Arcane Eruption, you're also technically picking up energy orbs. Thus, now you can constantly acquire universal orbs to fuel your Sentinel armor. This will also cause the AoE knockdown spam every single time you pick an orb up. The result? CC spam, fireworks, and increasing Lavos survivability. This lets you get a little bit around the issue of shield gating, and honestly, I just find it's a little bit amusing watching enemies being constantly knocked down. Now let's take a look at other support options. His 1 generally we won't cast that much since there's many other ways to get health regen. One method is looking at your operator arcanes where you have Magus Elevate or Magus Repair. So this would take up 1 slot, and another way to support him would be to run either Magus Lockdown or Anomaly. Or if you choose to heal with his 1, or other methods which I'll explain later, you can run both Lockdown and Anomaly for a hard CC while grouping enemies together to give you an easier status spread. This will give you more breathing room to reposition as well as giving you more efficiency on your 4. His 2 we will be using to prime Viral or Corrosive through crowds, and this is where Anomaly can help group them together, but note that this build already has very big range on Vial Rush already, so you may not actually need Anomaly since its range is very similar to the modded ability we have achieved here. For his 2, you will want to cast whatever of Viral or Corrosive that your primer is missing. His 3 can be used to reset his 2 or 4, and you should really only be casting this on groups of enemies, as the cooldown of the 3 itself cannot be reduced. It has a 15 meter range radius on this build. You will probably want to imbue it with the opposite of Viral or Corrosive that your 2 didn't have, or whatever your primer is still missing. Generally, you will want to save this to cast after your 4 if possible, as it can easily shave off anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds of your cooldown on this build. His 4 is the Nuke, and you do not want to cast this on enemies unless they have at least both Viral and Corrosive at max 10 stacks. Optimally, you want to stack a bunch of other statuses as well on them to be able to abuse that condition overload-esque effect. You want to imbue gas on this ability as it is a massive AoE and will use that massive condition overload initial hit to determine the dots. This can very easily kill enemies and end up doing hundreds of thousands of damage per tick. And this build expands to a total of 62.5 meter radius. So as you can see, you have a lot of options to prime your enemies before you cast your 4. The ability usages on his 2 and 3 have pretty decent range, letting you choose between them as primers or your guns, being Kuva Nuke or Zymos, or even Cedo, which is perfect for Lavos as a signature weapon before you cast your 4. Juggle this loadout as however you see fit. Obviously the best primary on this build is Cedo, as it lets you set up all the missing basic elements as well as instantly maxing out on viral or corrosive procs. A simple cast of your 2 will cover your missing element. This is a balanced build that lets you play around with all his abilities and is very useful for spreading status in general no matter what your playstyle is. I briefly touched over your companions earlier, but now let's take a closer look. Consider bringing Panzerwölfe as an option to have a constant AoE spread of viral. This way you only need to cast one ability to max out on your corrosive stacks or from your primer weapon, or not even have to cast your 2 and 3. You can easily apply the heat and gas beforehand with another ability or gun before you cast your 4 for the extra proc scaling into the condition overload multiplier. Using Companion also lets you take advantage of Hunter Recovery, which will give you a ton of HP regeneration with its lifesteal link. The Predazite Visier is another option, being more defensively focused than the Panzer and is perfect if you want more survivability, but it is still capable of contributing to your firepower. You have Iatric Mycelium to stack on top of your Hunter Recovery to passively regenerate your health alongside the health and universal orbs. This way, you most likely don't even need Magus Elevate and Repair and can run Anomaly and Lockdown as I stated. You can also equip the Mecha set to give AoE status procs if you kill the tagged enemy. This will refresh your status proc timer, giving you more longevity for your melee as well as casting your 4. You can also stack Mecha Pulse with Synth Fiber this way for massive armor tanking. Either way, you will want the full mech set if you do this to maximize the range of the status spread from the set bonus. This will include the Pulse, Empowered Overdrive, and Recharge mods, where Recharge can help you a little bit with shield gating. Every little bit counts. Finally, you can slap on Hunter Recovery as usual. Now let's take a look at that second build. So this is what I'd like to call a quote-unquote nuke build. It works, but I feel it gives up way too much of the rest of his kit to be really worth it. It turns him into a very one-dimensional frame that I don't feel is very fun to play, and you can probably nuke better with frames such as Mirage. So here, the first thing you'll notice is we actually built for efficiency this time, and this is because I'm trying to be able to have as much uptime on my 4 as possible and making it more spammy. Because of this, we need to dump some duration and range, and a solid amount of strength to ramp it up and near max it out. Our duration still matters, so that's why I'm running 170 efficiency only. I'm running a lower rank fleeting expertise so I can try and preserve as much duration as possible at 116. We lose some range, but that's fine because the build is focused mostly on his 3 and 4, which both have pretty decent range. His 2 will still be decently useful, but not as potent and AoE status effects as before. His 4 is weaker due to loss of strength, but it becomes spammable due to the high efficiency. You're getting 1.7 reduction per enemy hit with his 3. You can clump enemies together here with Anomaly, as well as imbuing other CC abilities onto his 2 and 3 such as Ensnare, or even just having other teammates on your steam forcing enemies into the circle such as Robin with his Vortex and Bastille. Make sure not to cast your Transmutation probe until your Catalyze has ended and is on cooldown. This is a very gimmicky build that can nuke, but once again I don't really recommend. If you absolutely want to run Helminth on Lavos, I'd recommend infusing onto his 2 or 3 because you need gas for his ult to be useful. Just note that you'll lose one of your 2 main AoE abilities for proccing status. His 2 is better for proccing, while his 3 can reduce the cooldown of all your other abilities. Which one you choose to give up is up to you. Infused abilities will get the same cooldown as the slot that you infused it on. The cooldown will begin instantly on abilities with instant effects. For sustained abilities, such as, say if you could infuse Covenant, the cooldown will not begin until the entire ability effect ends. And lastly, here is the Eidolon build that nobody asked for. We are going to infuse Eclipse over his 1 since there really isn't anything you can reliably hit to regenerate health in a hunt. Also, Magus Elevate is a much better way to heal as DPS since it's extremely reliable. You don't really have any one-shot attacks coming in from the Eidolon, so you don't need to worry as much. His 4 is very good at nuking any bombs during the healing phase, as well as his 2 for some decent mobility to freeze the bombs, but Magus Lockdown achieves the same thing, so it is a little bit redundant. Valence Block passive. We know that the Eidolon drops an energy orb every single time you break a limb. So when you pick this up, you can easily grab all the other ammo and everything, as well as casting your 3 to make universal ammo drops and more health, which really isn't that important, but it's the ammo drops that are super handy. Due to the Valence Block, you get status immunity and cleanse for 10 seconds, meaning you can run along the water line without having to equip Arcane Nullifiers on when you're collecting all of that ammo. I hope this information helped you figure out how to build your Lavos, as he was really making me rip my hair out deciding how things should go. Have you ever had a frame you stared at and wondered, what am I supposed to do with you? Because that was a first for me. That's it for this video. If this is your first time watching, consider leaving a like or a subscribe or telling me your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.